Again, these are all notes you should have. Scientific and academic thought should be secular, non-religious, worldly. Talk about rationalism, secularism, scientific method, experimentation, inductive reasoning, tolerance, belief in social progress, freedom of thought and expression, education of the masses. The religious ideology of the philosophers that comes about is deism. Deists believed in a God, but rejected an organized religion. Deism, the religion of the philosophers. Morality could be achieved by following reason rather than following the traditional teachings of the church. Deists saw no point in any particular religion. They recognized only a distant God uninvolved in the daily life. Your book, I think, describes Voltaire's description of deism. God, like a clockmaker, created the world and then just let it run, let it move. It did not intervene in it on the normal day-to-day operations. Just like a clockmaker makes a clock, sets it in motion, and lets it run. It doesn't intervene on the day-to-day aspects. Some early examples of using reason to place in thought, and this is conflicting with some of the other enlightened thinkers, but here's a good example. Thomas Hobbes did not believe in divine right, so rejected this idea that a king derives their powers from God, but theorized through reason that in society you guys were selfish individuals, and the only way to keep humans in control and try to prevent chaos is to govern with a strong absolute monarch. He believed in a social contract, which was an agreement that the people gave up their rights and freedom for an organized society. So you give up some of your freedoms that you have, and you turn it over to a absolute monarch. And you do that because people like stability and order. This is Leviathan. This is Hobbes outlining his reasoning for why you should support an absolute type of government. People don't like chaos. People like stability and order. How do you keep this organization? According to Hobbes, through a strong absolute monarch. Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke rejected that. Instead, he believed that the government exists to do what? To protect your rights. That the people are born with certain inalienable rights that cannot be taken away from you. And it is the government's job to protect your rights. And if the government doesn't do that, then the people have a right to abolish the government. Replace it with one that will. The beautiful philosophy of Locke talks about Tabula Rasa. The idea that you are born with a blank slate. And how do you gain knowledge? By filling it up with experiences. And the different experiences that you have throughout life is what makes you who you are. If you are restricted by a government, if you are restricted by a religion that does not allow you to freely think and experience outside of their parameters, then what happens with your slate? It isn't filled up. It's not filled up. You have a small portion that's filled up with those limited experiences in life, those limited things, and the rest of your slate is blank. And that's why we look at Tabula Rasa being such a significant aspect of these philosophers, is they want you to experience more things, make your choices freely by being able to experience more than just what's inside this narrow box. Okay? Tabula Rasa. Here's Locke's philosophy in a diagram. You are entitled to this. The government is in a social contract with the people, and it's to protect their rights. The people give the government their rights, and if the government misuses its power, the people have a right to replace or overthrow it. Locke, early philosophe, if you will, right? He was not French, and most of the French philosophers were French. He was English. He was an early philosopher. Diderot, encyclopedia, got together all the known knowledge of the time. You had these philosophers that contributed to it. Tried to put everything in a several volume collection of works. Why was it banned by the Catholic Church in certain countries?
Because it went against their beliefs.
It maintained ideas and philosophies that were contradictory to the church's teaching. And so if this had been during the time period of the Counter-Reformation, Pope Paul III, and the whole creation of the organization to try to maintain Roman Catholic principles, would this book have been on the index of prohibited books?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Voltaire, considered to be the most famous of the philosophers, attacked the old relics of the medieval past, championed social, political, and religious tolerance.
Well, is he the one who's like, I might not agree with what you have to say?
Yeah, he's the guy that we think of that would say something to the fact of, I may disagree with what you say, but will defend to the death your right to say it. And this is, this is just stuff we can get an idea about his philosophy, guys. The other guy we think of is Montesquieu. When we think of Montesquieu, we got to think of like the influence on the United States, our Constitution, checks and balances. How do you guarantee that you do not have one person in government or one branch of government having too much power? You separate the government's power. Well, what happens if the government separated the powers? What if this branch over here of government, what if it starts to begin to manipulate the others and the power begins to shift over here? What do you have? You have a built-in system of checks and balances that does not allow that to take place. So Montesquieu, 3 types of government that exist. You need to separate the government's power into 3 branches, give them all their own. Give them checks and balances. This is for the United States, right? Our executive, the president, Congress, legislative branch, the judicial branch, the court system, and they all have their own powers that allows them to check the other. Rousseau. Here's Rousseau. He is one of the late philosophers, but he's also one of the early romantics. And so some of his ideas are kind of contradictory to some of the early Enlightenment philosophers. When you look at the Enlightenment, your book says the later Enlightenment philosophers were a bit more radical in terms of their ideas. When we think of Voltaire, we think of what he did with toleration. When we think of Rousseau, we think of what he worked on in terms of the idea of man and society and the state of nature. And remember, the Romantics, nature and return to nature was a big part. In the state of nature, we are all free. Okay? We have certain rights that we have that we're born with. But we have chains that restrict us. But in nature, born in our natural state, we are very free. We don't have these chains. We don't have these restrictions. The idea of liberty, equality, fraternity, that becomes a motto for what revolution, guys? The French Revolution. Liberté, equalité, fraternité. That motto,
Can we watch that video again?
Rousseau's from where? Rousseau's from France, and he greatly influenced the French revolutionary ideas. We also talked about the general will, the concept of the general will. Salons. Where did educated elite have an opportunity to share their ideas?
In the salon.
Why couldn't they do so publicly in France?
Because they were...
You had a great fear of absolute monarchy putting you in prison. or executing you. So you did this in private. What did this give an opportunity for elite educated women?
Yes.
You gave them an opportunity to participate in this intellectual discussions because they could not do so. It was not accepted outside of the salon. Madame Geoffron is one of the famous members of the salon, leaders of this. It's kind of a very quick summary of these. Obviously, the influences of the Enlightenment.
Can you go over the stages of the French Revolution?
No, he's not serious.
All right, quickly on the French Revolution.
Hey, Josh, this is for you.
All right. Okay, not what I wanted. This is the back half of the French Revolution.
Wait, it started with the storming of the Bastille.
All right, yeah, let me, give me a second. Guys, quiet down.
Oh, there's tissues right there. There's tissues right there. What's on your arm?
Writing. An alphabet.
Alphabet?
There's a different alphabet. Still English. Just beware this form.
All right, French Revolution.
Basic B. W.
French Revolution began on July 14th, 1789. Before that, you guys, you should understand in terms of what was going on here, guys, before this. I should go back and...
No.
Remember we had the different estates, right?
That's not right.
Who's this guy represent?
The nobility.
Nobility.
The first estate, which was the... this is the clergy right here. First estate was the...
Clergy.
Second estate?
Nobility.
Third estate was...
Peasant.
Everybody else, right? You had, at the beginning of all this, they had the king in a financial problem called the Estates General. The Estates General was a medieval body that had not met since 1614 when the king called them in session 1789. The king had tried to change his tax structure in France, but had been denied doing so by the different parliaments in Paris that said they can't do it. The only way it needs to take place is through this body. Now, what was the problem? France was in a financial distress. Why was France in a financial distress? Well, wars that had been fought and paid for, the involvement of the French during the American Revolution, supporting the American colonists, the debt and the loans that they had on that debt to pay for it was ever increasing. And the only way the government could get out of it was to tax the other estates. They had already risen the taxes on the third estate to such a point where they could no longer continue to tax them. The third estate was already in a great, great financial problem with themselves. Shortages of bread, shortages of supplies. They couldn't tax them. The government could no longer tax them that heavily. The only way the government could get them out of debt, they felt, was to change the tax structure. The only way it could take place was through this body. First two estates exempt from taxes. They could not agree on voting rights. And when the king finally got a little bit more of a situation where he thought this was wrong, in terms of, he tries to reassert himself, he tries to lock out the third estate. Now, the political aspect we understand is, who is the third estate representing here in this political body of the Congress, of the convention?
Everyone except the nobility. And
No. In the third estate, who was there representing them as their representatives?
The middle class.
What social class were they? They were middle class. What ideology had the middle class come to embrace? Liberal ideas, enlightened ideas, right? They wanted to bring about greater equal taxation, greater equality before the law. Do they think that everyone should be equal?
Yeah.
No. They believe you should have equal opportunity, that we should be equal before the law, that we should be taxed the same, not just based on your privileges, based on birthright. They wanted those things removed, but they believe that you should have equal opportunity, and that what you did with your skills and your talents, that's what you do. So, the king attempts to lock them out of the meetings at the Congress of the convention, the Estates General, and it is during this time that rumors begin to spread that the king is assembling an army to put down and put out the people in France and Paris who have been rebelling. The Tennis Court vote, we talked about that, right? National Assembly now says they'll never disband until a new constitution is written. Tennis Court oath. New constitution is written. The people in Paris hear the king's assembling an army. And on July 14, 1789, they storm the Bastille to arm themselves. The king sends in a military. The military join forces with the revolutionaries. Is going to touch off a wave of violence in the countryside called the Great Fear. The Great Fear is going to force the National Assembly to be recognized by the king. The king will now be forced to recognize this National Assembly, but the Great Fear is going to cause the National Assembly to make changes. They will pass legislation in August, National Assembly, during the night of August 4th, that will eventually end all feudal dues. It will end titles of nobility, and the peasants will never pay feudal dues again in France. The National Assembly continues to work towards attaining liberty, equality, and fraternity, and they will adopt a tricolor flag, removing the Bourbon flag. You can see the Liberty cap. And the greatest triumph of this stage of the French Revolution is the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. This was signed by the National Assembly on August 26, 1789. Talks about liberty, talks about property, talks about resistance to oppression. It says man is born and remains free and equal in rights. Liberty consists in being able to do anything that does not harm any other person. Those are almost quote for quote from who?
Rousseau.
Rousseau.
Okay? Alright, now, however, they are still, Tennis Court oath, National Assembly will never disband until what?
Constitution.
New Constitution is written. Is a Constitution written yet? No, they're dragging their feet, they're trying to determine how much power to give the king. Does the king maintain veto power? And while this debate is taking place amongst the middle class and the monarch, who is the group of people that's going to push this revolution forward?
The
The peasantry. And the peasants are concerned with what? Voting rights?
No, survival.
Trying to survive. And a great example of that is the Women's March on Versailles on October 5th, 1789. They were seeking bread. Okay, they violently went and stormed the Bastille, or the Versailles, I should say, seeking the king and queen's head.
Isn't that when the woman was like,
anyway,
they don't eat bread, let's give them cake or whatever.
The monarch is eventually convinced by the Marquis de Lafayette and the French army to come back to Paris with the mob and save themselves. And they will be brought back to the Tuileries. Well, they'll be basically held. Eventually, you're starting to see outside of France criticisms come about. The big conservative critic was Edmund Burke. He was an Englishman looking at it from an English POV. He was a conservative with his biased opinion towards conservative aristocratic privileges, opposed to the liberal movement of the revolution. And in his Reflections on the Revolution of France, Edmund Burke said what's going to happen is all this anarchy is going to lead to a mess unless it's put down. Mary Wollstonecraft wrote a rebuttal to that, supporting the revolution, and then she'll eventually later write a vindication of the rights of women. Someone else beginning to write about women's rights is Olympe de Gouges. She's going to write, because the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen didn't say anything about women's rights, so she's going to write the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen. Okay?
Let's watch that video again! That video's hilarious. It's hilarious.
Bam. How does the revolutionary government pay the debt? Well, one of the things they did is they removed the Catholic influence on the land that they had possessed in France, and instead they confiscated the land, used the land as collateral for a new paper currency called the assignats. And this is one of the ways they're trying to get France out of debt. They also are going to force the clergy member, the Catholic clergy member in France, to sign the civil constitution of the clergy. The civil constitution of the clergy basically made the Catholic French clergy members take a vow of loyalty to the revolutionary government. They vowed their loyalty to the revolutionary government. Many of them did not. They left France. Many of them, because the Pope rejected all this, left France and tried to save themselves, if you will. The Pope obviously condemned this. The king will eventually accept a new constitution, and he signs it, and the National Assembly now has accomplished their goal, tennis court oath, and what are they going to do?
Disband.
Disband. However, what does the king do shortly after this?
He tries to flee.
He tries to flee. So that would be the peak of, if you will, the Enlightened ideology. They have a limited monarch king, but then the king never abides by it because he attempts to flee France. When he attempts to flee France, he's captured. Now what do you do with the Constitution? You got to throw it out, and you got to write a whole new Constitution. None of those original members of the National Assembly were allowed to run for the new Legislative Assembly, so it meant that you had a new group that were younger and more radical. And one of the influential groups that's going to come back is a small working class shopkeepers, the Parisian working class called the sans-culottes, and they are the ones that are going to kind of come about here to help push the revolution forward. During the Second Revolution, France was now declared a republic. Members were now well-educated, members younger, more radical, and the most radical of the group was the Mountain. And they will split with the Girondists, which were the more moderate, and the clear example of their division was when it came time to vote for the execution of the king for treason. It split along the lines of the Girondists thinking that we punished him enough, let's not execute him, and the more radical saying, off with his head. Okay?
Oh, and then
This is where we get our political spectrum, guys, during this time. We get the left being considered to be more radical, those in the middle being more moderate, and then those on the right being more of the conservative, the monarchists or royalists, those that support the status quo. Okay? Alright, so we see the Mountain versus the Girondists, the division that takes place there, how the king is viewed, the queen's viewed, and the new invention, the guillotine, the king's head's gone. Alright, so we have this radical phase that's taking place now as the Mountain's going to turn against the Girondists and accuse them of treason. We're also going to see that the French Revolution, already at war with because of the involvement of Austria and Prussia, now we're going to see them declare war in Britain, Holland, and Spain as well. While they were losing at the beginning of all this, the revolutionary government is going to eventually begin winning all these wars because the radicals are going to begin to gain the support of the sans-culottes and begin to make a change to a radical form of government under a dictatorship led by Robespierre, who controlled the Committee of Public Safety. He said we need to deal with this national emergency, so it's going to lead to these dictatorial measures. And what's going to happen is revolts are going to be put down by executing those individuals at the guillotine. The economy was saved because the Committee of Public Safety used socialistic tactics. They said in a planned economy what you would produce and what you would sell it for, how much you could sell it. Certain products were not allowed. No white bread was allowed to be produced, only brown bread. Nationalized all workshops. And they used terror to stamp out anybody speaking out against the government. That's considered to be the most radical element of that, as some 40,000 French men and women were executed during this year. Patriotic spirit began to spread throughout France. This was what allowed them to win. There was a great national pride that began to develop. So what do we see happening? What new ideology do we see developing? Nationalism. Why? Because the French people came together, a common people, common language, common culture, common background, versus a common enemy. And so that's what's going to help bring about this unification between them. The army is going to swell to over 1 million men as they were drafted into the army. It's going to allow the army to be led by young, ambitious generals. It's going to allow someone like Napoleon to rise to power.
Because of their merits.
Based on merit. Yeah, you got the radical stage going on. People pretty soon get upset. And then you had the Thermidorian reaction as Robespierre continued to go after all these people and eventually said, no more, we're not going to put up with it. And they turned against Robespierre. Robespierre was found guilty of treason and guillotine. That ends the reign of terror and now begins the Directory. And under the Directory,